Dear. It's podcast day. It's podcast day. Hello, welcome to the Hey BrownBerry Knitting Podcast. I'm so glad you've come by my corner of YouTube to visit. I thought today would be a great day for a podcast. The light is great right now. I'm sitting in my living room and it's Friday, October 26th. I'm happy you've joined me for this episode. I hope that you will be able to be at ease while we spend a little time together. My name is Mars. You can find me on Instagram and Ravelry as heyBrownBerry. Any information that I talk about in today's podcast, I will do my best to link in the description box below this video. I tend to do show notes 1 or 2 days after the video is published, so if you don't see anything when you look there, it just means I haven't gotten to it yet, but I will. I have several different things I want to share with you today. If you haven't visited my podcast before, you'll find that I don't follow a very specific format. I tend to record as I see time coming available, and that's what works for me, and I hope it works for you too. I have a variety of things that I'd like to show you, and I'm surrounded by them all, so you'll see me looking at them. And if I can, I always like to put in a break and just maybe play some video and some nice music so that if you are also sitting down to make while you join me, you can just enjoy that and not have to look up at the screen if you don't want to. I tend to listen to a lot of podcasts, even more so than I watch them. Is that the same for you? It helps to know that I can sometimes tuck my phone in my pocket when I'm going to vacuum or do the dishes and still enjoy time with my virtual friends by listening. And then if there's something they talk about that I would like to see, I can always go back and take a look. So be comfortable and let's tuck right in. My primary craft of late has been knitting. I do other types of making like crochet as seen here in this blanket. I fancy myself a very beginning sewer, and I hope to be doing more of that soon, and I'll actually show you today some things that have inspired me to do more sewing, but we'll start with the knitting. Today on the needles, I may spend a little time as we're talking to work on a very special project. It is a sweater. Doesn't it look like a sweater? For a tiny creature. This is actually the beginning of a sleeve for a long sleeve pullover that I'm working on, and this pullover is going to be something I design as I go. I was inspired to make this as part of the Not Everybody Goes to Rhinebeck Virtual Festival, which just passed last weekend. In honor of festival season, I was part of a group of vendors and makers who participated in what we called Not Rhinebeck 2018. And it was a festival for the rest of us, those who couldn't make it to the New York Sheep and Wool Festival in New York City in Rhinebeck. And a part of the festival and a part of the community style activities was to knit a sweater. Many people often knit a sweater with the goal of finishing that sweater in time for Rhinebeck or other festivals. And so the Not Rhinebeck Sweater Cowl, which is currently running and will continue running until the beginning of November, was a way to encourage us to cast on a sweater. And if you go to the Tiny Human Knits Ravelry group, you will see threads there for the Not Rhinebeck Sweater Cowl. Beautiful finished sweaters are in there, sweaters in progress. And then there's mine. I would say that this sweater will be a labor of love because I changed my mind several times about the yarn I was going to use, and I finally landed on using yarn that I've dyed myself. My daughter and I have a yarn company called Dynamics on Etsy, and we've really been getting into natural dyeing lately. So dyeing yarn using mostly foraged plants or food waste or things that we eat already and would normally throw away, such as avocado skins and pits, onion skins. We use things from our yard, pine needles, ferns, and other naturally derived materials to dye yarn. This is some of our naturally dyed yarn, and it was a new to us yarn base. It was actually provided by a really good friend, Lindsay of the Fiber Seed. She sent us some yarn and some natural dye materials to try out, and we had a lot of fun doing that. My friend Natalie of Remembrances Pottery also provided some yarn support for us to explore our natural dye experimentation. So my sweater cast on was really inspired by this set of worsted weight yarns that we had naturally dyed. And until we had finished up with the last batch, I hadn't yet decided exactly what I was going to do for a sweater. I kept changing my mind about pattern types and which yarn to use. And then I noticed these on my shelf where I put everything after it's been dyed, and I thought, I love the idea of a sweater made with yarns I've dyed. So they've all got different, they've all been dyed differently. This particular yarn is actually, I believe this is a Knit Picks worsted. And when I watch podcasts, I like to be able to see the item for a while, so that's why I kind of hold it up for a little bit. The color is not quite so washed out. I think it's because of the light why it's not coming through true to color. Let's see. It's a bright yellow. And this was dyed with goldenrod, dried goldenrod flowers that my friend Natalie provided us. No, I'm sorry. I have to think about that. No, I believe this was dyed with tansy. I'll have to double check my yarn labels. I do have a Ravelry project page for this sweater, so you'll be able to see the yarn information. Yes, I believe this was dyed with tansy, a beautiful yellow flower. We recently tried madder root for the first time. If you're familiar with natural dyeing, madder root is a very popular natural dye. It gives a whole range of colors, pinks, reds, purples, all depending on the dye fixer, mordant that you use, or modifiers that you use, things like iron. There's so much great information about natural dyeing out there if you're interested, but essentially these were dyed with madder, and we used some processes that gave us shades of an orangish red. So I think those go beautifully together. And then we have this more naturally dyed, more of a natural base color, which was dyed with acorns and a little bit of an iron modifier. So it's, I would describe it as a very pale brown. It's on its way to tan color, but it does have a gray undertone. because of the iron and acorn combination. So I am planning a sweater using all of these yarns. It is going to be a pullover style, striped. I've had some great consultation from my sweater guru friends, and I decided that the best way to get a really good fitting sweater that is just the right style for me is to design as I go. If you've knit garments before, you know that you cannot escape the math when knitting garments. So I decided that if I was going to create the design for the sweater, I'd have to embrace the math and call on some help from my resources. And by resources, I mean my pattern books. This book is the Knitter's Handy Book of Sweater Patterns. And in it, if you're not familiar with it, it's a book by Ann Budd. In it, there are several options for sweater types, like this drop shoulder sweater. And then within that sweater type, there are charts. You can see that. There are charts that are based on your gauge, so you have to swatch, and the size you're trying to achieve, and it covers each section of a sweater within the parts of the chart. And so essentially it will tell you stitch counts to cast on, number of stitches to work, and then guide you through increases or decreases as appropriate for the different parts of the pattern. So drop shoulder is one of the types of sweaters. There are also set-in sleeve sweaters where you create the body of the sweater and you can knit the sleeves separately, and then you seam the sleeves into an armhole opening. And there are also saddle shoulder sweaters. I find saddle shoulder to be a pretty flattering, flattering is a very subjective word, but I find them to be aesthetically pleasing. I like the way a saddle shoulder fits, and the fact that you can also, if you like, do designs across the shoulder as part of the sweater design. And then there are sweater types that we're more familiar with, like raglan sweaters. Now that is shown as either a pullover or a cardigan. Let me see if I can find a good example. So this is a raglan cardigan, buttoned. And raglan, if you're not familiar with sweater construction, is where you have an even number of increases across the front and back of the shoulder. And so what you have is a shape that kind of grows from the neckline towards the armpits, and then the body is knit, you know, in whatever way you choose, and the sleeves are knit coming off of those increased panels. So this book really has essentially hundreds of options if you combine body construction, neck construction, sleeve construction. In multiple ways, you can get a lot of options out of this. I primarily use this book to help guide me with my starting measurements for what I wanted to cast on. I've decided I'm going to do my sweater bottom up. I am, as you can see here, knitting the sleeves separately. And then I'm going to use another one of my reference book. I found out I'm twinning with Grace of Babel's Traveling Yarns podcast because she just got this book as well, Knitting Without Tears, by the ever-famous Elizabeth Zimmerman. This book is also a recipe book, I'll call it, for knitting. And particularly, it has good pattern guidance for when you're knitting according to your swatch and to your size. It helps you through the primary areas that you want to use for a sweater. It's very much about sweaters knit in the round, so with circular needles. And thankfully, there are pattern notes. I can't even call it a full pattern because Elizabeth really wants you to kind of trust your common sense, use a few basic principles and measurements, and go from there. So there are guidance notes in here for a bottom-up raglan sweater, and it walks you through exactly how to join together the parts of your sweater. So like I'm doing, knitting the body up from the bottom and knitting the sleeves separately, it walks you through how to then join those major pieces together and start doing your decreases toward the neckline in order to create this raglan shape. So maybe you can see there the raglan shaping. I wasn't sure what I was going to do in terms of shoulder and arm treatment and neck treatment, but I happen to be wearing a sweater that I knit previously, which is my Breathing Space sweater. That's a pattern by Vera Valimaki, and it's a raglan sweater, and I realized that that shaping fits me quite well. I've knit a yoked sweater before. I've knit an open front cardigan with a collar. I like both of those very much, but the raglan is more in line with how I want this pullover to look. I'm not sure if I'm going to do a V-neck or a crew neck or more of an open neckline. I'll probably decide that as I go. But I feel like between these two books, I have the majority of the pieces worked out. And I took some time. This book is really handy. It has a pocket in the back, so you can hold your notes or pattern pages. And I took some time to draw out my plans for the sweater in terms of measurements. I prefer sweaters with some shaping at the bust, at the waist, and even at the hip. I'm pretty curvy, proud of it, and I want to account for that in knitting the sweater without doing it boxy just to fit everything. So I drew out this schematic, and really this comes from having used other very well written patterns and understanding the areas where you kind of check in with your measurements. So understanding where or how long I want my sleeves, how much ease I want to have in areas like the hip and the waist, the distance between different body parts, like getting from my upper hip measurement to my lower bust measurement. There's a gradual decrease and then increase that happens there, and I like the sweater to mirror that shaping. So I kind of mathed out what I would like to do in terms of measurements, and we'll see how close I can stick to that. I have to keep reminding myself that what I measured with my tape measure around my body is my exact measurements, and so I need to allow for ease. I want to put a couple of inches ease into the pattern so that it's not clinging to me. I want to show you my swatch. So my swatch is done in these two yarns, which happen to be the darkest and lightest of all the colors. And I decided that I would do a sizable swatch this time because I haven't used this yarn before. This yarn is new to me. It's the brand is Sestari, and it was gifted to me. It's listed as a DK weight, but it's actually knitting up close to what I typically get for a worsted weight yarn. So here's the label. It says Sestari. And this is an American wool. It's their traditional collection, and they're based in Churchville, Virginia. So it's 100% wool. It came in a natural white, about 3.5 ounces per skein. 100 grams was 250 yards. So that's right around, it's a bit lighter than a typical worsted. Anywhere between 200 and 220 yards per 100 grams is what I typically see for worsted. So I decided I better swatch and see how it actually knits up, because a sweater is a lot of stitches. You want to get it right. So here's my swatch. Dangly ends, of course, just in case I change my mind and want to pull anything out. I decided that I would try first this natural color, so I would just be focused on the stitching. And this bottom portion I knit in a US 7. I believe that's a 4.5 millimeter needle. And then I wanted to see how I would do my striping, since color blocks will appear at different parts of the sweater, and I wanted to see how best to combine them. And then I also wanted to try another needle size down. So I went down to a US 6 4 millimeter needle. For the striping, just as a small design element, I did one row of color work. If you can call it color work when you're just alternating stitch colors across one row? I think so. So when I introduced the orange, I used both the orange and the tan color across the whole row, just alternating the colors in the Fibonacci sequence. If you're familiar with the Fibonacci sequence, it's just a mathematical sequence that's been shown to be aesthetically pleasing, whether it's in stripes or how things align. And it's essentially you start at number 1 and then you go chronologically and add the following number. So 1, And then you could do 1 plus 1, which is 2, 1 plus 2, which is 3, 3 plus 2, which is 5, 5 plus 3, which is 8, and so on. It's the Fibonacci sequence of numbering. And so I used that as a way to decide how many stitches of each color I would do across different parts of the pattern. So I would knit 5 tan stitches and then 3 orange, or I would alternate 1 orange, 1 tan, 1 orange, 1 tan, 3 times, just generally using that math principle in no particular order going across, and it made these really pretty little dips of color from the orange into the tan. So I like that so much I decided I would use that as a way to incorporate stripes as I go. And this, I won't put it on right now, but it fits me like a headband. So I might keep this swatch unless I need the yarn. I might keep it and wear it as a nice cozy headband. Be a great way to use the swatch. And I really got to know the yarn because I wet blocked it, let it dry, and it does soften up a little bit after washing, so that was good. It gets a tiny bit more drape, not very much, so it holds its structure, which I'll have to account for as I'm knitting. If I want ease, I'm going to have to knit the ease into it because it won't have a lot of looseness and drape, even from wet blocking. So it's good to get to know the wool like that. And thank you so much, Lindsay, for introducing me to a new yarn base. So I feel like I'm pretty well set and on my way. I've been working on the sleeve just since last night. I finally got around to doing it, but yeah, I'll work slowly on it. I really am not going to kid myself into thinking that I will finish it by the November deadline for the Knot Rhinebeck knit along, but I'm happy participating as well as learning some things about designing and sweater structure. I'm knitting this on a set of Cubics needles. They're double pointed needles. The sleeve is more easily done on these double pointed needles for me, and I haven't had a chance to use this size before. They're Cubics needles which have square edges. It's a little hard to see the square edges, but instead of just a round column shape, they're squared off on the edges, and I find them very, very comfortable in the hand. If you have experience with these, let me know what you think, but I'm seriously considering getting at least one other size in these because I've been sailing along with this sleeve, and my hands don't fatigue as easily as with some other knitting methods. Let's take a fabric pause. Today's headscarf, as you've seen in some of my videos, I'm really enjoying wearing these eco-printed scarves, which are made by Maria of Ninja Chickens. Hello, sweets. She has kindly gifted me a couple of these, and I have bought a couple of them from her Etsy shop. She recently had an update with some beautiful silk prints. Very tempting. I encourage you to go take a look. I've got eucalyptus and some logwood dye and other beautiful colored pieces in here. I love the pinkish purple. It's kind of a lavender color with the splashes of orange and pink. And honestly, I went in the bathroom and I wrapped it around my head and came and sat in front of the camera. That's how much I love these scarves. I feel like there's no wrong way for me to wear it. So the bonus fact that it was printed with plants and printed by my lovely friend is just an extra lovely add-on. So that's what I'm wearing today. It's not quite time for more knitwear here in South Florida, so I'm not sporting any of my own hand knits, but I'm sure you'll understand that. Temperature's still quite toasty for us, even towards the end of October. Further on the subject of fabric and natural dyeing, no format, right? My daughter and I have also started experimenting with dyeing fabric. We've got this cotton flannel fabric that my mom actually gifted us. My mom, bless her, she is part of a nursing organization that provides healthcare services to some people in small villages in Nicaragua. And for a couple of years, she's gone on a group trip with the nursing association to help out in the clinic in Nicaragua and go around and see different parts of a small village city there and work in the clinic in the daytime to help the citizens. And she typically brings a lot of items with her that people can't get there very easily. And this year she had the idea of using some cotton flannel fabrics to make reusable diapers. A lot of the people who come into the clinic are mothers with small children, babies, and so she bought a huge roll, what do they call that, a bolt, a bolt of this fabric. It came in a very bright white, and I helped her to cut out several panels of it in about the right size that we could seam up for diapers. Unfortunately, because of the political unrest in Nicaragua, this year's trip was canceled, which was really a shame. My daughters had planned to go with her and be part of that charitable effort, but it was not safe for them to travel there at the time the trip was planned. So we're hoping for next year that they'll be able to do it. So here we were left with a lot of this fabric, which my mom is still planning on sending a good bit of it through the organization when she can. And she let us keep some of the pieces so we could play around in the dye pots. So this is just a partial stack. These were all cut into about, I think it's 20 inches by 14 inches from the bolt. And we just went to town with trying out different dyes. In many cases, if we had dyed yarn with something, we would use the partially used dye stock or even fresh dye stock to dye these fabric pieces. So I won't show you all of them, but maybe I'll do a little video just inserted so you can see the group of them. I'll show you a couple up close. These were very recent. You've got a dark tan, olive green, a gray almost going to black, and it goes in all different areas across the fabric. The cool thing about this is it's very much like tie-dye. If you've ever done tie-dye on fabric, you know that depending on how you fold up the fabric, roll it up, bundle up, you get all of this really cool patterning, and it just depends on which part of the fabric touches the water and how long it sits in there. So we find all these beautiful colors playing across the fabric. And I'm getting smarter in my old age, so I'm starting to keep notes of how we dyed any one particular thing. I'm not at the point where I feel compelled to repeat a lot of things exactly and have multiple batches of the same thing, but I do love being able to go back and seeing how a specific mordant or modifier affected the dye, or keeping track of how long it took to soak something before I got a certain color, because those are elements I might want to repeat even if I'm using a different dye material or I'm dyeing on a different yarn or fabric. So that's in a darker color range. Just from the materials we've had available to us, I find that pinks and yellows are pretty common colors that do very well for natural dyeing. Pinks, rose colors. We got some olive green and some fern printing. This next one is avocado and tansy. So after an avocado dye bath for yarn and a tansy dye bath for yarn, we just mix them together and we got this brownish orange, almost a brick color. And like I was saying about the tie-dye, depending on how you put the fabric in the water, and we purposely scrunch it up, you get these amazing prints. Plans for these to be determined. I love looking at them, so I find them sort of artistic just to look at. But I have thoughts of doing a small quilt, lap quilt, that has a sample from some of them. And I also have thoughts of making project bags or bags that we'll use for gifts, and stitching them up with either drawstring or zippers, and maybe using another solid base. We've also done some dyeing with acid dyes on fabric. This is like true tie-dye style. And I used a squeeze bottle on these. So just, you know, dots and swirls and other things combining colors. It's been a lot of fun, and I think they would make really great project bags, you know, with something like this at the top of the bag and then a solid color bottom and maybe a light color inside. Big plans, big plans. At least I've gotten to the stage where I have a nice stack to choose from in terms of colors and things that I can play with. So I'm excited about that. I feel really grateful. You know, something that didn't work out for us as planned was still a really great, it turned out to be a really great activity, especially for Adachi and I, to play around with the way colors express themselves on fabric versus yarn. That's been a really fun experience. Sticking with the theme of our natural dye experimentation, my friend Andrea, who's the Adirondack knitter, sent me a huge bag of fiber samples a while back. Look at that. I've actually taken some out of here. It was chock full. Some of them have been dyed, others are natural and undyed, and they're all labeled with the fiber type. And these are for me to play with and spin and see what I like. And I actually was so inspired by having these small bits of different types of wool that I thought, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get kind of two uses out of each of them, and I'm going to take some of the natural ones and dye them. So these, for example, this is a white American wool, and this one is a Coopworth top, and I've dyed these with yellow onion skins. And they really took the color quite well. Like I said, I'm having a lot of luck with yellows and pinks so far, and reds. And I also had some merino fiber that a friend had given me in a huge ball of roving. It was a big ball of roving kind of wrapped up, and it was meant to be for, I think they call it jumbo knitting, arm knitting. So she had gifted me a book on arm knitting with this large ball of natural merino. And I'm not an arm knitter. With arm knitting, you can use your arms like needles, so really large knitting needles, and you kind of pull stitches. You create stitches by pulling the wool over your arms, the same way you would pull loops through on knitting needles. Just not my thing. I've seen some things made from arm knitting, you know, large comforters or pillow covers and things, and I get the instant gratification element of it. But I knew that I wasn't likely to use it for that, so I tested the roving, went and found some more information about it, found out it was 100% merino, and decided that I would use it for dyeing experiments instead. So I started taking off 1/2 ounce to 1 ounce pieces of the roving and playing with dyeing. So this is an acid dye version, and I've just braided it. Just playing around with some blues and purple, gray, black. And I used some of that roving for natural dyeing as well. These were actually dyed with acorn and an iron bath. So again, very pale brown, a pale, nice gray. Avocado pits and peels give a very nice dye. Huge range of color from avocado. One of the colors you can get quite often is a peachy color. So I dyed some roving in a braid format. so that some of the fiber was exposed to the dye and some was not exposed, so it was kind of like a resist, and again, similar to tie-dye. We've got a beautiful color out of that. And let's see, this one I solar dyed, meaning I put the fiber into a jar with the dye stock, the liquid, and sat it outside for several days. This is the Merino Roving again. Yeah, so this is more yellow onion skin, but instead of simmering water on the stove to heat up the dye stock, I let the sun heat it up in a glass jar, and the color came out quite rich. These have all been rinsed. You can see that. It's quite bright. So I'm a new spinner. I'm a drop spindle spinner, and these smaller amounts, these 1 ounce amounts, are very manageable for me to take and spin up some yarn. And I typically do, you know, I'll spin a single ply, just one ply of the roving, and then another single ply, and then I'll ply them together. I don't know a lot about different plying methods and so on yet. I'm learning about them. I actually have this book, Respect the Spindle, by a very well-known spinner, Abby Frankmont. And so I'm learning how best to use the drop spindles that I have and play with the fiber that I have. Hubby just popped in to say hi. He's back, everybody. He's back from voting. Make sure you go out and vote by November 6th. So I have a shocked spindle. That's one of my spindles. This is about almost a 4 ounce spindle. It's one of my larger ones. And on there right now I have a little bit of that Merino Roving. It's actually a pale peachy pink color, similar to what you saw earlier. This is also from an avocado dye bath. So I'm just working on using the things that the materials that I create. I want to use them more. I enjoy the color process so much, but I also don't want to just add to my stash of materials. I like to add to my stash of handmade goods. So I'm hoping to stay consistent with spinning a little bit each day or every couple of days and turning this into some 2-ply yarn, either for socks or hand warmers. I'm trying to be realistic about starting with smaller projects, especially because I'm still getting used to the mechanics of spinning, so I don't do long periods of spinning on the drop spindle. I'm certainly not at the point of spinning a sweater quantity. I'm not sure if I'll get a spinning wheel, but I want to use what I have now and still create hand-spun yarn that's functional. If you are a spinner or beginning spinner or considering it, I'd love to hear how your journey is going with that so far. So I'm very fortunate that some of my adventures in making include really awesome things that I get to have and to share. My friend Kelly of the Celtic Cast On podcast and I are the owners of Maker's Merch, which is a making community centered business. Our shop is Maker's Merch on Etsy. And one of our recent products it has become an instant favorite of mine. This is the sling tote. And we call it that because you can sling it over your arm and carry your knitting everywhere with you if you like. Or it can just be a tote that you stick into another bag, a larger bag. And it can even sit bucket style next to your favorite comfy knitting chair. I just folded the handle down to convert it. You can see my needle keeper poking out. So it can sit flat. It's made of a very gorgeous heavyweight cotton twill. This dark gray outside and light gray inside is by special request by our design. And I'll put a link to it in the Etsy shop. We have a few of them left, but it's great, especially now in festival season and when going to knit night. It's great to be able to tote it around. Inside my sling tote, I've got the one colorwork project that I have on the go right now for knitting. And it's holding my double pointed needles for this beauty. This is a sock it's a pattern design called Brigitte's Garden Socks by Natalie of Remembrances Pottery. It's just very recently released on Ravelry. You'll see that I have some waste yarn here for where I'm going to insert the heel. It's an afterthought heel pattern. And I'll actually open this up so you can see it better. So that's just my waste yarn for where I'll go back and insert the heel. But look at this patterning on the back of the sock and on the front. These gorgeous floral patterns. Isn't that beautiful? Now, the best thing I can say about this, other than it's been designed beautifully and written beautifully as a pattern, is that I am a fairly new colorwork knitter. I've done one colorwork sweater before, and I have not worked with multiple yarns in a project very often. And I found this pattern so easy to follow. The charts are amazing. And it's what I call potato chippy. So just getting to the next petal in the flower, the next section, is so addictive that it's kept me going. I am actually maybe 15, 20 rows away from finishing, including my cuff. So this is a project I've been tucking into. I'm using some fern fiber Romney and some Countess Ablaze. This is actually a sport weight and a DK weight yarn. And I'm knitting this on, let's see, I think these are my 2.75 millimeter DPNs. I just dropped one. Sorry about the earthquake. So I'm knitting this on DPNs and finding it a very smooth, comforting knit. The contrast is exactly what I wanted for this color work. And being sport and DK, it's pretty hefty, but it doesn't feel uncomfortably heavy. Just judging by, sliding it over my skin, I love it. I'm very excited to wear these. So Brigitte's Garden Socks by Natalie Sheldon on Ravelry. I highly, highly recommend this pattern. It's, I think, appropriate for any level of colorwork knitter, and I'm hoping that there will be a knit along so that I can finish my second one along with some of you. So that's living in my sling tote, which is great because I actually sit them in here so that one ball of yarn is coming out and fed from one side and the other ball of yarn is being fed from the other side. So that works nicely in my tote. I love our little logo tag here too. For makers, by makers. That is a nice work in progress to tuck into. Some people might not find color work to be relaxing knitting, but the rhythm of sitting down and following the chart and just going stitch by stitch and watching the colors change, I find it very therapeutic. Is that the same for you? Do you do color work as not mindless knitting, but sort of mindful knitting, where you're just following the flow of the stitches and the different colors? That's how it is for me. I'm really enjoying that. Natalie and I have a bit of a design along going. She encouraged me recently to work on a sock pattern design that I've had in mind for a while, and she's been kind enough to test it. And she's a great cheerleader because I never realized how daunting the process of designing can be. So I started my own version of the sock as a way to check and double check parts of the pattern. Natalie has already finished her first test knit, so I've gotten great feedback from her and from Maria, who also tested it for me. She actually showed a preview of it in one of her recent episodes. So I've started and frogged and restarted. I'm just using a yarn that I dyed, just a merino nylon blend that I dyed in this color. It's a very tonal blue-green. See if I can get it to show up well for you. Lots of dimension in there, which plays very well with the stitch pattern. My goal, here's my public accountability, my goal is to release this pattern by my birthday on November 18th. I would like to have it fully tested and tech edited by that time, and my testers so far have been just a cornerstone of this process, let's say. They've given me excellent feedback, so I'm working on my own version for photographing, and I'm working on the pattern itself. Hats off, scarves off to designers out there. It is a very reflective process. It's new to me, so there's a lot of self-doubt that goes along with it. And putting stitch patterning on paper versus on your needles feels like like two different worlds, because I'm invested in doing the pattern well, but I'm also really trying to create something that's going to give people joy when they make it. So think good thoughts for me, and I hope to have a sample of it to show you fairly soon. Well, that's the end of the fiber and fabric content for today. Similar to last time, I'm hoping to spend just a couple of minutes on a topic that I've been thinking about. So this time what's on my mind is appreciation versus validation. In my last episode, I talked about comparison and how connection and comparison collide when we connect with each other over social media in particular. And this time I've been thinking about appreciation and validation in that same context. I'm very frequently on Instagram. It is the primary way that I connect with other makers. I follow people who are knitters, who sew, who quilt, who weave, who spin. Fiber and fabric arts are my primary interest right now. So the great thing about Instagram is through following certain people and hashtags, you can really curate your feed to show you the things that you'd like to see. And I love that. Ravelry has some element of that for me as well, in that I join specific groups and I look for specific projects when I want to get more information. And again, it's somewhat curated in terms of the threads that I am part of and the things that I follow. On the subject of appreciation versus validation, I think my thoughts on this are very specific to Instagram, but probably apply to other social media outlets like Facebook, Twitter, other areas where we share. Quite often I get ready to share a post on Instagram and I do a bit of a double check. Am I putting this out there because I'm excited to share this item, or it's an update to something I've talked about, or it contains something I want to feature and help signal boost someone else or something else? Am I putting it out there so that others can appreciate it the way I do? Or am I putting it out there for validation? I love that folks share their projects and their progress, and I love doing that. But I do that double check because there are times when I can feel overwhelmed with the need to post or the need to show that I've reached a certain level with knitting, or that I'm gaining new skills as a dyer. None of those are bad things. The community is there for that, and I've been welcomed for those kinds of posts. But because I can often fall into the trap of only feeling good about something if it's validated externally, I've learned in several decades of living that it's good for me to do that gut check. Appreciation, meaning someone will see it, they may compliment it, they may make suggestions, they might have a Me Too moment where they're making the same thing or on the same part of their path. And because of that, they can appreciate it, and they show that appreciation through likes and comments. Validation, on the other hand, feels more like I'm only a good knitter if a lot of people like this thing that I'm doing, or I'm only good at dyeing if it's as good as, back to comparison, what someone else is doing. So I talk about these things because they're on my mind, and I love to hear what other people think about appreciation versus validation, especially through social media. Again, this is not an instructive topic. It's just something that I've been noodling on, and I love that as a way of connection with you. I love to hear your feedback on that topic. I hope that what most of us are doing is appreciating the time and effort that goes into the making of others. And I hope that by that we feel validated in a way, but don't feel trapped by looking for validation. So, in light of that, I'm going to go and appreciate my projects and my works in progress a little bit more. And I'm very, very glad you were here to join me for this little time in the episode. I would love for you to subscribe to the channel if you'd like to know when I release another video. Either way, find me on the internet and let's connect. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you next time. Bye.